In 1969, a high school dropout named Eddie Antar opened a small electronics store in Brooklyn called Sights and Sound. Within a few years, he renamed it Crazy Eddie. He hired an actor named Jerry Carroll, dressed him in a sport coat, told him to scream the word insane at the camera, and ran the commercials on every local New York station so often that some stations stayed on the air overnight just to keep selling Crazy Eddie ad slots. At its peak, the chain had 43 stores across 4 states, generated $350 million in annual revenue, and was so culturally dominant in the tri-state area that Crazy Eddie's name recognition surpassed that of Coca-Cola. Then it turned out that Eddie Antar had been committing one of the largest stock frauds in American retail history. He fled the country, hid in Israel using a fake passport, and was eventually arrested, extradited, and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Crazy Eddie was not the only audio retailer in America during that era. It was one of dozens of chains that defined the way Americans actually bought their stereo equipment for 40 years. And every single one of them is gone. Start in Berkeley, California in 1968. That is where a small specialty store opened under the name Pacific Stereo. And within 15 years, it had become the largest hi-fi retailer in the United States. At its peak in the late 1970s, Pacific Stereo operated more than 130 stores in landlocked states like Illinois, Texas, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Missouri. Places where you might expect a chain called Pacific Stereo not to exist. The chain was owned by CBS, the broadcasting giant, which also owned Columbia Records and Fender guitars. Pacific Stereo's real innovation was the house brand strategy. The store sold real audiophile gear, brands like Marantz, Pioneer, JBL, and Advent. But it also pushed customers toward private label products that CBS manufactured and supplied to itself. The house brands were called Trans Audio at the entry level, Quadraflex in the middle, and Concept at the high end. The Concept line received good reviews and is still respected by collectors. Quadraflex was a different story. According to former employees, the markup on Quadraflex was enormous, and the speakers were often demonstrated in the corners of the room where the boundaries naturally boosted the bass response. The strategy worked for over a decade, but by the early 1980s, CBS was preparing to sell off its non-broadcast assets, and in 1983, Pacific Stereo was shut down. All 130 stores, all 5 house brands, all of it gone within months. The largest specialty audio retailer in the country was liquidated by its corporate parent because hi-fi no longer fit the strategy. On the East Coast, the story belonged to Tech Hi-Fi. The chain was founded in the mid-1960s by 2 students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, a mathematician named Sandy Ruby, and an engineer named John Strobing. They had been running a small stereo operation out of their dorm room and decided to turn it into a real business. Their first store opened on Vassar Street in Cambridge, just outside the MIT campus. By the late 1970s, Tech Hi-Fi had grown to over 80 stores, mostly in the Northeast, with more than a dozen locations in and around New York City. The chain's reputation was built on knowledgeable salespeople. Tech Hi-Fi salesmen were trained to actually understand the equipment they were selling, to ask customers about their listening preferences, and to demonstrate components in side-by-side A/B comparisons. The store's annual catalogs became collector items in their own right, featuring elaborate photographic spreads of stereo systems set up in fantasy environments. A 1979 system featuring components from Crown, Nico, Infinity, and Tandberg cost $10,000 at the time, which is roughly $38,000 in today's money. Tech Hi-Fi died in the mid-1980s. The combination of a recession, the rise of discount big box retailers, and the arrival of the compact disc, which collapsed margins on physical audio equipment, drove the company into bankruptcy. All locations shut down. The chain that had introduced thousands of New England college students to Sirius Audio simply ceased to exist. Back to Crazy Eddie, because the full story is darker than the commercials. From the day Eddie Antar opened that first Brooklyn store, the Antar family was skimming cash sales, paying employees off the books, and depositing millions of dollars in offshore bank accounts in Israel and Panama. The fraud was the business model. When the company had its initial public offering in 1984, the stock price jumped from $8 to over $75 per share. Then Eddie Antar cashed out his shares and resigned. Outside investors took over the company in 1987 and discovered that $45 million in listed inventory simply did not exist. The fraud unraveled. Eddie Antar fled to Israel in February 1990 using a fake Brazilian passport. He was eventually extradited in 1993, convicted, retried after his conviction was overturned for judicial bias, and finally sentenced in 1997 to 8 years in federal prison. The government recovered over $120 million from his offshore accounts. Every Crazy Eddie store closed. The brand that had been more recognizable than Coca-Cola in New York was completely gone. Crazy Eddie's biggest competitor took a different path to extinction. The Wiz, originally called Nobody Beats the Wiz, was founded in 1977 by the Gmal brothers in New York City. The chain spent the 1980s and 1990s undercutting Crazy Eddie, and after Eddie Antar's collapse, the Wiz became the dominant electronics chain in the tri-state area. It sponsored half the professional sports teams in New York, including the Yankees, Knicks, Mets, and Rangers. In 1996, when Major League Soccer announced a team called the Kansas City Wiz, the chain threatened legal action and forced the team to rename itself the Wizards. At its peak in 1996, Nobody Beats the Wiz had roughly 67 stores and over $1 billion in annual sales. Then the chain expanded too aggressively, going from 20 stores to over 80 in less than a year, and the cash ran out. Nobody Beats the Wiz filed for bankruptcy protection in 1997. In February 1998, Cablevision Systems Corporation acquired the chain for approximately $80 million, hoping to use the retail footprint to sell cable subscriptions, cable modems, and digital set-top boxes. The strategy did not work. Cablevision lost roughly $500 million trying to keep the Wiz alive over the next 5 years. In February 2003, Cablevision announced it was closing the chain. The last Wiz store shut its doors that summer. The last act of the American audio retail era belonged to Tweeter. Tweeter was founded in 1972 by Sandy Bloomberg, who opened a single stereo shop near Boston University in Brookline, Massachusetts. The company was originally called the New England Audio Company. By the late 1970s, it had been renamed Tweeter after the high-frequency speaker driver and was building a reputation as a premium audio retailer with knowledgeable staff. In the 1990s, after taking on venture capital investment, Tweeter went on an aggressive national expansion. The company went public on NASDAQ in 1998 under the ticker TWTR, raised $46 million in its initial public offering, and used the proceeds to acquire 10 regional chains, including Bryn Mawr Stereo in Pennsylvania, Hi-Fi Buys in Atlanta, and Sound Advice in Florida. At its peak in the early 2000s, Tweeter operated over 180 stores in 13 states with 3,700 employees and annual revenue approaching $1 billion. But the model was already breaking. Big box retailers like Best Buy and Circuit City were squeezing margins. In June 2007, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was acquired at auction by Schulze Asset Management for $38 million, less than 5% of its previous valuation. The new owners attempted a turnaround, failed, and filed for bankruptcy again in November 2008. On the morning of December 2, 2008, Tweeter store managers were told to immediately lock their doors and leave. Sales associates were terminated over the phone while driving to work. 600 people lost their jobs in a single morning. The chain that had defined premium audio retail on the East Coast was erased overnight. One strange footnote remains. In 2013, when Twitter announced its initial public offering, confused investors briefly drove the abandoned Tweeter stock symbol up by over 1,500%. The defunct audio retailer accidentally became a meme stock 5 years after its own death. 5 chains, 5 different ways to die. Pacific Stereo was killed by its corporate parent. Tech Hi-Fi was killed by recession and the compact disc. Crazy Eddie was killed by fraud, prosecuted by the federal government, and the founder went to prison. The Wiz was killed by a cable company that thought it could turn an electronics chain into a marketing tool for cable modems. Tweeter was killed by Wall Street expansion and big box competition. And the type of business all of them represented, the local specialty audio retailer with knowledgeable salespeople and a back room where you could compare components, is essentially gone from American commerce. You can still buy audio equipment. You can buy it online. You can buy it from a warehouse store. But you cannot walk into a Pacific Stereo on a Saturday afternoon, ask a salesman who has been listening to music professionally for 20 years to demo 3 different receivers through 3 different pairs of speakers, and take an hour to decide. That experience is over. The next time you put on a record or stream an album through your speakers, take a moment to consider the system you are listening to. There is a reasonable chance that some of the components, especially anything vintage, were originally sold by a retailer that no longer exists. The entire infrastructure of American audio retail has been replaced by an algorithm, a search bar, and a delivery truck. The music still sounds the same. The way you bought it does not.